Okay, good evening, everyone. It's 4 o'clock, so we will get started for the evening. Welcome to week number 5 of the spring semester. So I hope everyone had a good weekend. I know today is President's Day, but here at Cal State Long Beach, we just trudge right on through. And so we have classes today and all offices were open. So unfortunately for us, we don't get the day off for President's Day, but kind of is what it is here at Cal State Long Beach. So the good news for us is that it means that we're allowed to have class tonight, which allows us to cover the material we need to. And in such a compressed semester, if you will, as we have in a hybrid course, it's imperative that we have all of our sessions so that we can cover all the information that we need to cover. Speaking of covering the information that we need to cover in this course, tonight, we are going to wrap up our discussion of the study of public administration. Last week, we talked about the idea of public administration as an academic discipline. We defined the characteristics of what comprises an academic discipline. We talked about the differences between public and private sectors in order to provide more justification for this separate study of public administration that Woodrow Wilson advocates for in his Study of Administration article that you read again for this week. And then what we're going to do tonight in the first half of class is we're going to finish off that discussion of public administration as a field of study or a discipline by talking about the theories that have developed within the field of public administration. And when we talked about academic disciplines last week, we said academic disciplines typically had unique phenomena that they studied that differentiate them from other academic disciplines. They applied unique methodologies and unique approaches to study that unique phenomena. And then they use those approaches and those methods to develop information that will then serve as the basis for unique theories to understand the relationship of phenomena within that field. And so that's kind of how we define an academic discipline. So the last piece of the puzzle here for us tonight is to talk about some of those unique and sometimes not so unique theories that underpin the study of public administration. So in the first half of class tonight, what we'll do is we'll go through the chronological development and evolution of these theoretical perspectives on public organizations, on public administration. And we'll go through the classical school, then we'll go into some neoclassical schools, talk about all those theoretical underpinnings so that by the end of the first half of class tonight, you will then have the information that you need to not only do scenario number 5 on the midterm assessment, but also to then do your Canvas essay number 4. And so speaking of both of those assignments, midterm assessment is due next Monday, February 26th, no later than midnight on February 26th. And then Canvas essay number 4 is also due on February 26th by midnight. And for Canvas essay number 4, you'll then be developing an argument for why public administration either is or is not an academic discipline. And as we have discussed kind of ad nauseum already, there is no right answer to that question. Some people find it to be an academic discipline. Some people think it's a subfield within political science. You will come to a position on that argument, come up with a position in answering that question of whether or not public administration is an academic discipline, and then justify your answer. So the information from the first half of class tonight will help inform Canvas essay number 4. Then kind of looking ahead to where we're going to go, then in the second half of class tonight, if everything goes well timing wise, we will then move into the final major topic of this course, which will be looking at the functions of public administrators. Essentially, what types of things do public administrators do on a daily basis? So in the second half of class tonight, we'll get into a discussion of public administrators and the roles that they play in the public policy process. So we'll go back and pick up on some of the information we talked about last week in terms of the role of public administrators in the formulation of public policies, in the implementation or execution of public policies, and then in the evaluation of those public policies. So we'll talk about some of the roles that public administrators play in all 3 of those phases. Then we'll talk about the roles that public administrators play in the implementation, evaluation of public programs. And we'll differentiate between what is a public policy and what is a public program. And we'll kind of be foreshadowing in the second half of class tonight information that you'll get in your 670 policy issue analysis course in the future, as well as your 696 research method / program evaluation course that you will also be taking as one of your core requirements. And we'll see how we progress. That last bit of information on the syllabus in terms of the effectiveness of the public sector. I don't know if we'll get to that information tonight. We may have to hold off and do that information then at the beginning of class next week. So that's the plan of where we are at and then where we are going. Then in future weeks, then we'll turn our attention to the discussion of the management of human resources as a function of public administration. And then finally, the management of fiscal resources, again, as a function of public administration. And that should then round out our quote unquote semester together. I am hoping if everything goes well, then we'll be able to finish up all of our information by March the 4th. And then on March 11th, rather than having class, we can afford you the opportunity to use that time then to complete your final assessment. And speaking of the final assessment, I'm not going to make that available to you until next Monday. I want you to have a chance to finish your midterm assessment first. But then next Monday, your final assessment will then become visible for you. And we'll spend some time at the beginning of class next week talking through the final assessment. So that's where we are, and that is where we are going over the next couple of weeks. But just be forewarned, these next 3 weeks are going to go by very, very quickly. So we need to just kind of keep that in mind because we will be done in the very near future. Okay. But just a reminder, midterm assessment due on Monday, next Monday, and Canvas essay number 4 also due next Monday as well. So let's go ahead and finish up our discussion of public administration as a discipline or as an academic field of study with a discussion of how the theoretical perspectives have evolved over the years in public administration. So as we go through the discussion of all these different theories and how these theories have evolved, I want you to keep your eye on 3 different things. One thing to keep your eye on are some of the similarities between these different theories and these different schools of thought, and kind of look at those linkages and that connective tissue that kind of ties a lot of these theories and these schools of thought together. The second thing I want you to keep an eye on is to keep an eye on the differences between these theories and these schools of thought. So what differentiates the classical school from the human relations school? What differentiates the human relations school from the school of human resource management? So similarities and differences. And then the third thing I want you to keep your eye on, where did these theories come from? Because again, if we're defining an academic discipline as a field of study that really develops its own unique theoretical approaches, the study of unique phenomena, then we have to ask ourselves the critical question, well, does public administration fit that bill? Does public administration fit that characteristic? Are all these theories, or at least a majority of these theories that we talked about tonight, are these homegrown theories? Are these unique theories that grew directly out of public administration? Or did we borrow these theories from other fields of thought, other academic disciplines, and then modified them to make them fit our study of public organizations? So keep your eye on those 3 dimensions as we go through our discussion of the evolution of the theoretical perspectives on administration. So all of this information we're going to cover here in the first half of class tonight is kind of a little primer for you for your PPA 660 Organization Theory and Behavior course that you'll be taking in the future. Organization Theory and Behavior is offered primarily by Dr. Baber, who is currently on the faculty early retirement program. So I think he's only offering 1 section of 660 per semester. The other faculty member who routinely offers 660 is a person by the name of Robert Dominguez. Robert Dominguez is a long-serving adjunct faculty member of the department who also has a very long and very illustrious career as a city manager. He's been a city manager in a variety of different cities, Los Alamitos, South Pasadena, and many other cities. And he's been doing the city management job, if you will, for well over 30 years. So if you're interested in becoming a city manager, and that's one of your career goals, I would certainly recommend thinking about taking 660 organization theory with Professor Dominguez, because he's got a really great uh, repository of stories and different things that he's lived through as a city manager, where he can really bring to life a lot of these theories and place them in a practical setting of a public organization. This summer, I will be teaching a section of 660 organization theory as well. I'm doing that in the first summer session. It will be a 6-week first summer session course. And so if you are looking to get 660 done, you can consider taking that in the summer in summer session number 1. But all this is kind of a foreshadowing that information you'll get in 660. But as a survey-oriented course, there's only so much flesh on the bones that we can do in terms of talking about these theories. So what we're going to do tonight is just kind of take from that 30,000-foot helicopter type of level, a look at how these different theories and schools of thought have developed over the past 150 years. It's just not a discussion of the entire universe of theories, obviously, but just a highlight of some of the major influential theories and schools of thought that have really defined public administration since the late 1800s. So where we always start this discussion is we always start the discussion with the classical school of organization theory. And the classical school of organization theory, 3 of the major authors in that classical school, and there are others, but just the 3 that we'll talk about here tonight: Max Weber, and you see his picture on the bottom left of the screen; Frederick Taylor, you see his picture in the middle of the screen; and then Luther Gulick, you see his picture at the bottom right. So let's talk about each of those authors in turn. And as we do that, we will talk about how all their theories then contribute to the understanding of public organizations. Let me go ahead and turn my camera off to try and save a little bit of bandwidth, because I see I kind of disappeared. So maybe that'll save some bandwidth tonight. Again, if I get kicked out of the session or something like that happens, just hang into the session. I will get back in as soon as possible. So the classic school of organization theory usually starts with a discussion of our good friend Max Weber. Max Weber's training was primarily in the field of law. And so as such, since he was trained in law, he had a very strong belief in written laws, written rules and regulations, really did believe in rationality. Weber believed that we should make our decisions not based upon just what we believe or what we feel, but rather we should make our decisions based upon empirical information. We collect empirical information, we analyze that information, and then we use that information in order to form our decisions. Now, when he's talking about empirical information, as we'll talk about again later on tonight, empirical essentially just means information that you can sense. So it's information that you can touch, information that you can read. It's tangible type of information. So here's a big believer in rationality in law. So a lot of his approaches come from the world of law, and somewhat to some degree also from the world of sociology, because he made major contributions to the discipline of sociology as well. One of the most important parts of Weber's theory is his theory of ideal bureaucracy. So what Weber focused on is Weber focused on the structure of the organization. And Weber's primary goal was to try and structure the organization in order to make that organization as efficient and effective as possible. So his primary goal was the efficiency and the effectiveness of the organization. And he accomplished that through organization structure. That's what he referred to as his ideal bureaucracy. And it was very much this one-size-fits-all approach. That if we could structure all of our organizations in this ideal bureaucratic structure, we could then have efficiency and effectiveness. So for him, the ideal bureaucratic structure consisted of things such as a tall hierarchy. It's that pyramidal shape that we had talked about last week, where you have a singular head at the top of the organization, then as you move down the organization chart, you begin to encounter more and more and more positions. So that at the bottom of your organization chart, that's where the plurality of your employees reside, is at that bottom of that organizational chart. So it takes on this very pyramidal shape. It's a very top-down, it's a very centralized way of organizing and running a bureaucratic organization. In this tall hierarchical pyramidal shape to your organization structure, you then have a lot of what he calls division of labor. We divide up the work among the different members of the organization. Most of our organizations today are predicated upon division of labor. In your organization, you probably have a position with a position description and a position title. You do certain types of jobs on a daily basis that are probably different than some other people who work in the organization. By dividing up the labor, we're able to divide up the work and become more efficient as an organization. The third principle is specialization of task. So once we divide up the work, everyone then is responsible for a different set of tasks. They specialize in these tasks on a daily basis. So we'll have some people who are human resource managers. They will specialize in the management of human resources. We have some folks who are budget analysts. They will specialize in the analysis of budgets. We have some people who focus more on being program specialists. So they will focus on the implementation of certain programs. That's specialization of task. The nice thing about specialization of task is when people specialize in tasks on a daily basis and they do those jobs day in and day out, they then by definition should become experts in those jobs. And so our organizations then become staffed by experts who know what they are doing, which again then enhances the competency of the organization. And when you look at when Max Weber was doing a lot of his writing was being done in the late 1800s. Then again coincides with the era of merit, coincides with the Pendleton Act, coincides with some of the writings of Woodrow Wilson in terms of this idea of benign objective administration. This ideal bureaucratic organization will then be built upon unity of command, which means that everyone has someone to whom they are accountable. And so everyone has a supervisor, and there's this unity of command that goes all the way up the organization chain, all the way up to that person who is in charge of the organization. Sometimes this idea of unity of command is sometimes referred to as a scalar chain. Put that in text chat. But sometimes it's called a scalar chain, where again, everyone's responsible to someone above them, who's responsible to someone above them, and so on up the organization structure. Then we also have what's called a span of control in an ideal bureaucratic organization. Span of control means that a supervisor is only accountable and responsible for a limited number of employees. So the span of control for a manager may be 5 employees or 7 employees or 12 employees, but they will have a limited span to their control, a limited number of employees that they are responsible for. These experts who are working in these bureaucratic organizations, this ideal bureaucracy, they are professionals and they are career employees. And so they are in this organization for a career. They are not free agents who are going to jump around from one organization to another. They really view this organization as being where they are at for the next 30, 40 years for their entire career. And a very important part of ideal bureaucratic organization is reliance upon written documentation. So this is writing down those rules and those regulations and those processes and those procedures so that we can adhere to those processes and procedures regardless of what individual citizen we are dealing with. This helps to protect individual rights. This helps to make sure that we are treating everyone equally. It also helps with the institutional memory, so that if someone does retire from the organization, the person who comes in and fills that position, they know how to do the job because everything has been written down for them. So everything is written down in written form through written documentation. Again, very much based upon this idea of rationality. So Weber's ideal bureaucratic organization was a rational organization, and he felt that that was by far the best way to structure an organization. Because by structuring the organization in this manner, you will then create efficiencies, you'll then help the organization become more effective in accomplishing its goals and its objectives. So the big takeaway from Weber's ideal bureaucracy is that it is organizationally focused, that the goals are not individual employee goals, but rather the goals are the goals of the organization. Individual goals are subjugated and subordinate to the goals of the organization. So it's a very macro level way of looking at the organization. Another big takeaway from Weber is that the way you achieve efficiency and effectiveness is through structure. Now, if you structure your organization like this is what will make you efficient and effective. So again, Max Weber, coming from this legal background, writing primarily in the late 1800s. Then when you think about the turn of the century, going into the early 1900s, and you think about some of the things that were going on in the early 1900s. By the early 1900s, we have now seen the federal government get more involved in the regulation of workplace safety. We know that we had a lot of discontent in a lot of our factories at the turn of the century because they had become very dangerous places to work. Workers were being exploited. Workers were obviously very unhappy. And so you then had some authors who started talking about how can we make organizations more efficient and more effective, not by really looking at the structure like Weber did, but rather looking at the processes of work. So how can we change the process of work in order to make the organization more effective and more efficient? So one of the loudest voices at that time was someone by the name of Frederick Taylor. And Frederick Taylor is best known for his theory of scientific management. So what Taylor wanted to do is he wanted to, again, emphasize efficiency, but he wanted to do that through the work process as opposed necessarily through the structure. So what Taylor wanted to do is he wanted to discover what he called the one best way to do a job. And so scientific management was predicated on this finding the one best way to do the job. So the way in which Taylor would do it is he would engage in these time motion studies. That if you've studied a public administration at the undergraduate level, I'm sure you've talked about this before, but these time motion studies whereby he would actually have a productivity expert with a stopwatch who would stand behind employees as they did their daily jobs. That productivity expert would then time every single movement that that employee took for the purpose of getting rid of all the inefficient movements. Taylor referred to those inefficient movements as false movements. So when to get rid of those, identify the true movements, those movements that are efficient in getting the job done, collect all those efficient movements together into what he referred to as the one best way to do the job. And so the classic example in scientific management is the example of a very simple job such as shoveling pig ore. And so you position yourself behind the employee, you would have a stopwatch, you would time the amount of time it took the employee to take their shovel, put it into the pile of pig ore, the amount of time it took them to pick that shovelful up, the amount of time it took them to take that shovelful over to a cart, the amount of time it took them to dump that shovelful into the cart, and then the amount of time it took them to go back to the pile and start the process over again. So you would deconstruct the job into its component elements for the purpose of trying to create efficiencies. Those types of time motion studies were at the very heart of this idea of scientific management, finding the one best way to do the job. And so what we've ended up with is that because of Frederick Taylor and scientific management, now in public organizations, we have these things such as position classification systems. We have things such as job analysis, job evaluation, the creation of job descriptions. All those things are kind of artifacts of this scientific management type of an approach. And when we get into a discussion of the management of human resources in our functions of public administration discussion, We will talk about things like a job analysis and what a job analysis is, deconstructing a job into its component elements. We'll talk about job evaluations, the comparison of different jobs based upon the results we got from those job analyses. The idea of then taking those job evaluations, assigning compensation, and then placing those positions within a position classification system, using the information then to write position descriptions. All of that comes to us from scientific management and Frederick Taylor. So the similarity between Weber and Taylor is that they were concerned about the organization far more so than they were concerned about individual employees. So they had a very macro focus. Another similarity is that they both focus on the idea of efficiency within an organization. Another similarity between Weber and Taylor is that they really focus on this one size fits all approach. For Weber, it was the one best way to structure the organization. For Taylor, it was the one best way to do a job. Because once you identified this one best way to do the job, you then trained all of your employees to do the job in that one best way. You would then monitor their performance to make sure they are doing the job in that one best way. If they are, then you reward them with money. You give them compensation for doing the job correctly. If they are not, then you remove them from the organization. As for Taylor, employees were just cogs in the machinery of the organization. And if you think about a machine like that has cogs in it, you can picture these cogs, they all have teeth around them. And one cog turns, and the teeth on that cog then engage the teeth on the cog next to it, which then turns that cog, and so on and so on. If you have a broken cog that doesn't have all of its teeth, then you take that broken cog out, you throw it away, you replace it with a brand new shiny cog. Same type of thing with an employee. If you have a broken employee, quote unquote, who is not doing the job in the one best way, you remove that person and you replace them. People were replaceable parts, just like the cogs in a machine. It was a very poor view of individual employees. So Weber and Taylor both share that very poor view of individual employees. They were much more concerned about the organization. Obviously, the big difference, Weber looked at structure, whereas Taylor looked at work processes. Now, it's important to note that a lot of Taylor's work came out of the world of business. So a lot of his theories were applied first and developed first based upon private sector organizations. Then we took those theories that came out of the private sector and we then applied them to public organizations. So it's very much a private sector type of theory. So Weber comes from the world of law. Taylor comes to us from the world of business. And again, there are a lot of other classical theorists, but in addition to Weber and Taylor, the third classical theorist that we present here in this class is a gentleman by the name of Luther Gulick. And Luther Gulick was a little bit unique in comparison to Weber and Taylor, in that Gulick did a lot of his work within public administration. A lot of his theories were designed within public administration for public organizations. And then Gulick served on this very important commission called the Brownlow Commission. And the Brownlow Commission was charged in the 1930s with the responsibility of reforming the federal bureaucracy in the wake of a lot of these New Deal programs of the FDR administration. When FDR came in with his New Deal programs resulted in the creation of a lot of new federal agencies and a whole lot of new federal programs. And a lot of these grant programs, as we talked about a few weeks ago, when we talked about the development of federalism. So you've got this greatly expanding federal bureaucracy, and there's a recognition that presidents were having trouble, or that president was having trouble managing this ever enlarging federal bureaucracy. So the Brownlow Commission was established for the purpose of reorganizing the federal bureaucracy to make it easier for the president to manage the federal bureaucracy. And we're not going to get into a lot of the things the Brownlow Commission did, but one of the major things that the Brownlow Commission did is it created this thing called the Executive Office of the President, known as the EOP. And the Executive Office of the President was an umbrella agency that would house a lot of the agencies that were what we call management or overhead agencies, agencies that were created for the purpose of helping the president manage different aspects of the federal bureaucracy. So it's supposed to add some rhyme and reason to the management of the federal bureaucracy. And Luther Gulick was a member of that Brownlow Commission. Luther Gulick was able to take some of his theories to the Brownlow Commission, and some of the recommendations that came out of the Brownlow Commission directly reflected a lot of Luther Gulick's thought process and a lot of Luther Gulick's writings. So Luther Gulick here is kind of our first real public administration theorist, if you will. Even though he was more trained in generic management, he really did apply a lot of his work to the public sector. Luther Gulick is probably best known for the principal school of management. And this principal school is something we introduced last week when we talked about the Graham Allison article and similarities between public and private sector organizations. Remember, Allison told us that there are certain similarities between public and private organizations that he termed POSCORD. All organizations plan, they all organize, they all staff, they all direct, they all coordinate, they all report, and they all engage in budgeting. That essentially is what came to be known as the principal school under Luther Gulick and others. The idea that Gulick had is that this principal school could serve as a managerial toolkit of sorts, whereby these are all tools in a toolkit that you can provide to public managers. Public managers can then reach into this toolkit and they can pull out the tool that is most appropriate for the situation that they are dealing with. So at certain points in time, you have to engage in planning. So you pull out your strategic planning tool. At other points in time, you need to organize the structure of the organization. You pull out your organizing tool. When you need to hire employees and match employees, you pull out your staffing tool, and so on and so on. So he felt if we could provide managers with these management tools, with this management toolkit, then we can make those public managers more efficient in managing their organizations. So to then compare Gulick to Weber and Taylor, because he is part of this classical school, some people call him the principal school, but I usually put him within this classical school. Similarities between Gulick and Weber and Taylor is, again, they are looking at the organization. They're taking a very macro level approach to the organization. They are trying to make the organization more efficient and more effective. They are not that concerned about individual employees and the wants, needs, and desires of individual employees. If you have an unhappy employee who is not being productive, then you can get rid of that employee and replace that employee with a new employee who hopefully will be more motivated and more productive. So there's still this very organizational level macro approach. Still focusing on efficiency and effectiveness of the organization. The difference obviously is whereas Weber looked at structure, Taylor looked at work processes, Gulick now is looking at managers. And he's saying if we can give managers this toolkit, we can make those managers more efficient and effective in managing their organizations. But what ties Weber, Taylor, and Gulick together is really this one-size-fits-all approach. What we would say is the search for a panacea, the search for a cure-all. Weber, Taylor, and Gulick all felt that they could develop this one best way and then apply this one best way in every single organization. For Weber is the one best way to structure. For Taylor, the one best way to do the work. For Gulick, the one best way to train and teach our managers how to deal with situations. So they all were focused on this panacea, this one best way in order to achieve efficiency and effectiveness. But Gulick here for the first time is someone that we really kind of consider a public administration scholar, because most of his work was done in the field of public administration, as opposed to Weber, who is more legally based, as opposed to Taylor, who is more based in the business world. However, all these classical theorists all kind of devalued individual employees. They were all looking more at the benefit and the health of the organization as opposed to the best interest of individual employees within that organization. And that obviously was a problem that really became magnified in future schools of thought. And so several different schools of thought then grew up as responses to the classical school. A lot of schools grew up as what we call a rejoinder or a response to the dehumanizing approaches of the classical theorists. And all of these schools that were developed as a criticism of the classical school, we oftentimes call the neoclassical schools of management. Neoclassical in that they were the response to the classical school. So some examples of these neoclassical schools are schools such as the Human Relations School, the School of Human Resource Management, the School of Systems Theory, and then some more modern approaches such as the Quality Management School, the School of Organizational Culture, the Leadership School. So these are all what we would call neoclassical schools that challenge some of the basic assumptions of the classical theorists. Now, we're not going to talk about every single one of these, but we are going to talk about several theorists in each one of these schools of thought. So let's start with the neoclassical school known as the School of Human Relations. So the School of Human Relations was really created again as a response to the lack of focus by the classical school on individual employees and the recognition that we really needed to look more at those individual employees and their wants, needs, and desires as opposed to just focusing on the macro level of the organization itself. One of my favorite theorists, and you had an article by this theorist in the classical text, is Mary Parker Follett. And one of the reasons why I've always liked Mary Parker Follett a lot is that Mary Parker Follett was one of those authors who was writing and saying things at a time when those things were not popular. So when you go back to scientific management really kind of hit its heyday in the 19 teens and the 1920s. And it had become so popular in the private sector that it had then transferred over into the public sector as well. But in the teens of the 1920s, you had basically one person who is standing up and kind of being that voice in the wilderness, one person who is willing to stand up and take issue with scientific management when everyone else was buying into it as the one approach to use for their organizations. That one person was Mary Parker Follett. Now, some people will consider Mary Parker Follett kind of a pre-human relations theorist. And if you take the 660 organization theory class with me, one of the textbooks that we use, the author of that textbook really does have an entire chapter on her as a pre-human relations theorist. And he considers her a pre-human relations theorist because of the period of time in which she was writing. Human relations theory really started to take off in the 1930s and the 1940s. But a lot of the principles in the human relations school were really being espoused by Mary Parker Follett 10, 25, 30 years before that. And so that's why some people call her pre-human relations. I include her in the human relations school because her writing really, I think, epitomizes a lot of the problems that human relations theorists had with the classical theories of Weber, Taylor, and Goen. Mary Parker Follett really challenged us to view our organizations as democracies. And Mary Parker Follett was not typically what you consider to be a public administration theorist. A lot of her training was more generic management. She made some contributions to the world of sociology and psychology as well. But she was more of a generic management type of theorist. But what she did recognize is she recognized that if we viewed our organizations as democracies, we could then make them better places to work and make those democracies more efficient and more effective. So she says, if we think about our organization as a democracy, we know that there are two basic flaws, two fundamental flaws in a democratic system of governance. And these are flaws that we had talked about much earlier on in our first or second week together. And those flaws are, number one, the passivity of citizens, that democracies tend to create very passive citizens. They create citizens who, when they do participate in their own self-governance, they're going to take the path of least resistance in order to participate. And as we had talked about in that first or second week, we said one of the primary ways that people participate in their own governance in a democracy is through voting. And they participate through voting because there are very few costs that are associated with voting as compared to other forms of political participation. And that's especially true today. Here in the state of California, everyone gets an absentee ballot, everyone gets a mail-in ballot. And you don't even have to go to the voting booth in order to vote. You can drop it in the mail, you can drop it in a vote box. It makes voting very low cost and very easy to do. You compare that to other ways of participation, things such as running for office, things such as campaigning for a candidate, giving money to a candidate, engaging in political dialogue, going to city council meetings. All those things require more time and more effort. And so people tend to usually be passive in that they'll vote, but they won't put the energy into all these other methods of participation. So it creates passivity on the part of citizens. She says the second flaw of a democracy is that democracies create particularized interests. And this takes us back to Federalist Paper number 10 and James Madison, his idea of factions. When Madison told us a democracy will create factions, it creates conflict between these factions. It's a natural outgrowth of a democratic system of government. And Follett makes the argument that's the same type of thing in our organizations, in that our employees tend to be relatively passive, and our employees also will engage in conflict because they will have different wants, needs, and desires that will sometimes come into conflict with the wants, needs, and desires of other people and other groups within the organization. So she said, just like in a democracy, we assume that there's going to be conflict. We assume that there will be conflict within an organization as well. That's natural. That is going to happen. You cannot completely eliminate it. So what you have to do is you have to learn how to resolve that conflict. And she argues that there are three ways to resolve conflict within an organization: domination, compromise, or integration. She says domination is the worst way to resolve conflict because one wins, one loses, which means that the party that loses is always going to be angry about it. They're never going to accept it. Domination is not the best way to deal with conflict. A better way, but still not the best way, is compromise, where you have the two parties meet with each other, they come to a compromise, one party gives something up, the other party gives something up, and then they come with a negotiated settlement. That's better than domination, but according to Mary Parker Follett, that's still not the most appropriate way of dealing with conflict within an organization. According to Mary Parker Follett, the most appropriate way is through what she calls integration. Integration is when everyone, through a horizontal and a vertical communication process, everyone in the organization has the opportunity to participate in dialogue and decision making. Once you have everyone participating, then you will be able to, instead of saying this side wins and this side loses, or we come up with a negotiated settlement where both parties give up something and both parties essentially lose, we will be able to integrate all these ideas together and synthesize them into a new and different way of dealing with this issue or with this problem. And that's what she calls integration. She says, in this integration process, by having all these people and groups come together and share ideas, the ideas of one group, one person will integrate and will then interpenetrate into the ideas of another. This is kind of this marketplace of ideas approach that we talked about a couple of weeks ago with Theodore Lowy. The interesting thing about Mary Parker Follett is that she predicates an organization's success upon it being a participatory organization, whereby through communication, we allow people to participate in their own self-governance. That is far different from the world envisioned by the classic organization theorists. Now, individual employees have an opportunity to participate. It's not as much of a centralized top-down type of organization. Now it's a much flatter bottom-up type of organization with employee participation. But I think the really innovative thing about Mary Parker Follett is that she presents to us this idea of a democratic participative organization, an organization that functions like a democracy, with a value placed upon power coming from the people, from the employees, and them having the opportunity to participate in their own self-determination. So you can kind of see how revolutionary a lot of these thoughts of Mary Parker Follett were at the time. The problem for Mary Parker Follett, obviously, is that the period of time that she was writing, she was a female. And so a lot of her male counterparts completely ignored what she was writing and completely ignored her ideas. And even though a lot of her ideas in terms of the formulation of this human relations school would later be picked up 20 years later by male counterparts. The fact of the matter is, at the time, she didn't get any credit for it. But that's why I really emphasize Mary Parker Follett, because looking back in retrospect, we can see just how influential she was in the creation of this school of thought known as the Human Relations School. So that's why we started Mary Parker Follett with the Human Relations School. Again, really starting to move away from the top down centralized approach of the classical authors. Another human relations theorist that you will talk about in your 660 class is someone by the name of Chester Barnard. And Chester Barnard, again, comes kind of from the business world. And Chester Barnard was most famous for a book he wrote called The Functions of the Executive. And one of the interesting ideas that Barnard developed is this idea that effective leaders and managers are only effective if they are able to get the compliance from their employees. Now, again, that is a much different perspective than we had in the classical school. Rather than saying you can tell someone to do something, if they don't do it, you fire them, you replace them with someone else who will do it. Here, Barnard is saying you have to get their acquiescence, you have to convince them, you have to get their compliance. And if you don't get the compliance of your employees, then you can never be effective as a leader or a manager. So what Barnard focuses on is he focuses on how can organizational leaders induce this compliance from their employees? How can they induce their employees to provide contributions to the organization in terms of effort, in terms of time, in terms of ingenuity? How do they get these contributions that are then necessary for making the organization efficient and effective? He says you can get that by the use of what he calls selective incentives. So you provide incentives to your employees that your employees will value. And if you provide the right set of incentives, that will then induce your employees to provide the right types of contributions through effort and productivity that will then make you effective as a leader as well as your organization effective. The problem, obviously, is knowing which incentives are appropriate for which employees. The basic root of Barnard's theories here is that you need, as a leader, to understand and know your individual employees. Employees are not just identical cogs in the machinery of an organization. Individual employees have different wants, needs, and desires. You need to understand what those wants, needs, and desires are, and then tailor the incentives in order to get contributions from your employees. Barnard also talked about knowing your individual employees within the context of another theory he developed called the zones of indifference. He argues that since leaders need to get the contributions, they need to get the compliance on the part of their employees. They also need to know what lines not to cross. So if you ask an employee to take a certain action to do something, and if doing that will violate the norms, the values, the ethics of that individual employee, you're going to get a lot of pushback from that employee. That employee is essentially going to say, nope, I am not going to do that because that violates my principles. So Barnard says, we not only need to know our individual employees in terms of their wants, needs, and desires, we also have to know our employees based upon their values and their system of ethics. So we have to operate within what he refers to as the employee's zone of indifference. So every employee has a different zone of indifference. If you can operate within that zone of indifference and not cross over to violating their values and their standards and their ethics, then most employers are going to be relatively ambivalent about doing it. Yeah, I'll do it, fine. You'll get their compliance as long as you're within this zone of indifference and you're not asking them to do something that violates their value system. So the upshot of all this from Chester Barnard and why he is a human relations theorist is that he advocates to us that we need to know our individual employees. We need to treat them as different human beings who have different wants, needs, and desires. They're not just the one size fits all type of approach that we had in the classical school of organization theory. So you can see with Mary Parker Fall and Chester Barnard, what we are doing is we're moving further away from the classical school, and now we're starting to put some value upon people who work within our organizations. But again, Barnard comes to us very much from the world of business. Another human relations theorist you'll talk a whole lot about in your 660 course is a theorist by the name of Elton Mayo. Now, Elton Mayo comes to us much more from a psychological type of perspective. In that, what Mayo does is Mayo's primary contribution is the recognition that organizations are social systems, that there are social aspects within organizations that the classical authors did not consider. So, according to Mayo, these organizations are social systems in that people interact with each other on a social level. If we want to create an effective and efficient organization, we need to recognize how these people interact with each other and kind of their social needs in the interaction with other employees. If you've read any Elton Mayo before, you know that Elton Mayo did in his co-authors did a series of different experiments. One of the most famous experiments came to be known as the Hawthorne experiment. So in the Hawthorne experiment, Mayo and his fellow researchers went to this Hawthorne electric plant, and they decided they wanted to study the impact of a change in a physical stimulus on the productivity of employees. So they thought one of the simplest things to measure is the lighting level within the plant. So the hypothesis is if we turn lighting levels up, if we make it brighter in the plant, people will become more productive because they'll be able to better see what they are doing on a daily basis. So his first hypothesis was you turn the lights up, people become more productive. So they turned the lights up, and lo and behold, people became more productive. Says, okay, let's try another hypothesis. Let's turn the lighting level down. And if we make it darker in there, we would assume that people will become less productive because they won't be able to see what they are doing. They turn the lighting level down, and as you may guess, productivity actually went up. Lighting level down, productivity went up. It was not the lighting level that was having an impact upon productivity. What was impacting productivity is the researchers' interaction with the employees. Because the researchers were talking to the employees, they were talking to them about their experiences in the plant. They were actually having conversations with the employees, and the employees were really starting to feel very valued as individuals. So it was really the interaction, the social interaction, that was causing an increase in productivity. Also, they placed employees within groups, and they realized that there was a group component as well to the social interaction. That whenever they placed people in groups, if one member of the group was not pulling their weight, they weren't working hard enough, it was making the rest of the group look bad, then the other members of the group would obviously put pressure on that person to make them work harder to make the group look better. So a second upshot of Elton Mayo's theory is that not only are these social organizations, but these are social organizations comprised of group dynamics. And we have to recognize those social group dynamics within our organizations before our organizations can become effective and efficient. So that's a really nice kind of microcosm then of this idea of human relations theory. With people like Follett and Barnard and Mayo, we are now recognizing the importance of individual employees for the effectiveness of the organization. We have to recognize that they are people. We have to recognize as people, they want self-determination. We have to recognize that as people, they have different sets of wants, needs, and desires. We have to recognize that people, they have social needs in terms of their interaction with other members of the organization. So with the human relations goal, now we're not just talking about a top-down focus on just the organization structure or the process of work. Now we're focusing on individuals working within those organizations. Hence the reason why it's called the Human Relations School. However, There is one similarity between the classical school and the human relations school. In the classical school, we were concerned about the goals and objectives of the organization. In the human relations school, we are still concerned about efficiency and effectiveness of the organization. What we are doing is we're asking if we recognize the wants, needs, and desires of employees, if we provide them with the right set of incentives and opportunities for self determination, if we do all of that, then we can make employees more productive for what end? To benefit the organization. So human relations theorists still were looking to benefit the organization, and dealing with your employees in a better way and in a more altruistic way really benefits the organization in terms of enhanced levels of productivity. But at the end of the day, the goal is still an organizational goal as compared to a goal of helping your individual employees develop as human resources. And because of that criticism of the human relations school, we then saw another neoclassical school develop known as human resource management theory. So, just kind of recap chronologically with Mary Parker Follett, we were in the 19 teens and the 1920s, and then Chester Barnard, Elton Mayo, we start moving more into the 30s and into the 40s and on the brink of the 1950s. Then in the 1950s and the 60s and 70s, we start to move into this school known as Human Resource Management School. And the big difference between Human Resource Management School and Human Relations School is that in Human Resource Management School, the ability of individual employees to achieve their goals becomes just as important as the ability of the organization to achieve its goals. So if you want to think about it from the old JFK phrase and kind of turn it around a little bit, in the human resource management school, we are no longer just asking what can the employee do for the organization, but now we're asking what can the organization do for the employee? How can the organization help the employee develop as a human resource, develop their own skills, develop their own talents, even if the development of those skills and talents don't benefit the organization? There is inherent value in helping human beings develop as human beings besides just what they can give back to the organization. And that's the big difference between Human Resource Management School and the School of Human Relations. So, the Human Resource Management School, we have three authors that we'll talk about here tonight in that school of thought. The first one is Abraham Maslow. And you've probably run into Abraham Maslow multiple times during your undergraduate studies, very famous theorist who kind of approaches all this from a psychological type of perspective. And with Abraham Maslow, he develops a thing called the hierarchy of needs. And you see that depicted on the right side of the screen with this pyramid of the hierarchy of needs. There are these 5 different levels of needs in the hierarchy of needs for individuals. At the bottom level, you have your physiological types of needs. And so you have things such as the need for food, the need for water, the need for warmth and shelter. Those are physiological needs. Those are at the base, for the most part, at the base of this hierarchy of needs. A physiological need is what he refers to as a deficiency need, that people will be motivated by a deficiency in these physiological needs. And so if you don't have enough food, you're motivated to acquire more food. If you don't have water, you're motivated to acquire water. However, once you acquire sufficient amounts of food and water, that then ceases to be a motivator. It's only a motivator if a deficiency exists. Next level up, what he calls the safety needs, the need to feel safe and secure from harm. Again, you're motivated. If you don't feel safe, you're motivated to try and feel safe. Once you feel safe and secure, then it ceases to be a motivator. So again, it's a deficiency type of need. Next level up, belonging needs, the need to feel that you belong to something, you belong to a group, you belong to a family, you belong to society. The more you feel that need, the more that you do feel you belong, the less that it serves to be a motivator. Next level up are things such as your esteem needs, the need to feel that you're held in high esteem by your coworkers and by your peers, that people respect you. Again, that's kind of a deficiency need in that once you feel you have that level of respect, it's no longer going to serve as a motivator. So esteem, belonging, safety, and physiological needs, those are all what he calls the deficiency needs. At the apex of this hierarchy of needs, you have what he calls self-actualization. Self-actualization is a being or a growth need in that it's never completely fulfilled. You're never going to be completely taking care of a deficiency in your self-actualization. You are always going to be growing as an individual, as a human being. Self-actualization is essentially, to borrow a phrase from old Army commercials, being all that you can be, achieving your utmost potential as a human being. And that's something that everyone will always be motivated to grow more in their self-actualization. So that never ceases to be a motivator because it is a growth need at the apex of the hierarchy of needs. Well, so what? Why is that important? One important aspect of this hierarchy of needs is that the hierarchy may differ depending upon individual. So this is kind of your basic hierarchy of needs that most people are going to have. But for some people, some of these needs may be inverted. So for some people, safety may be more important than your physiological needs. For some, esteem may be more important or more pressing of a need than your need to belong. And so people can have a different ordering to this hierarchy of needs, which then again means that we need to know our individual employees and then we need to help them not only fill these deficiencies, but also help them to continue to grow toward being all that they can be as human beings. So it suggests for us a role for the organization beyond just getting contributions from our employees. And there's a role for the organization in helping people grow as human beings. We should add a little caveat here is that this is the hierarchy of needs that Abraham Maslow developed very early on in his career. Very late in his career, just before his death, he revisited this hierarchy of needs and he made a few little changes. One of the major changes he made was to this self-actualization. So in the old hierarchy of needs, self-actualization was being all that you could be, achieving your utmost potential, but it was looking at you as an individual. Later in life, Maslow changed that, and instead of it being all you could be as an individual, he started to look at how people benefit their community. And that people, when they self-actualized, it went beyond just being what they could be as an individual, and it really became more about what they could do as an individual to help their society and to help community. Essentially, what people were able to give back to their society. And that really became more the definition of what self-actualization was in his revised hierarchy of needs at the end of his career. But here Maslow is telling us there is inherent value in helping people grow as human beings beyond just what they can give to the organization. And that's the big difference as compared to the human relations school. Douglas McGregor, who is again very much of a management type of theorist who also dabbled in the world of psychology, Douglas McGregor was a student of Abraham Maslow, really did believe in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and used it to then develop his theory of theory X versus theory Y. And again, not terribly creative names, but he identified two different types of employees, theory X employees versus theory Y employees. Theory X employees were employees who were relatively unmotivated. They were relatively unproductive. They were not terribly creative. They were not terribly innovative. They basically just kind of did what they needed to do to get along. As compared to Theory Y employees were just the opposite of that. Theory Y employees were employees that were very motivated. They were very productive. They were very creative and innovative. They came up with new ideas. They aspired for growth. They wanted to grow as individuals. They wanted to move up in the organization, aspire to higher authority types of positions. Those were your Theory Y types of employees. McGregor made the argument that the vast majority of our employees are Theory Y employees. Now, the Theory X employee, that's the type of employee you would have seen in the classical school of organization theory. McGregor says there are a few of those, and we've got a few clunkers in our organization. So there are still some Theory X employees, but the vast majority of employees will be Theory Y employees. But here is the problem. They are Theory Y employees who are working in Theory X organizations. So our organizations are still structured around classic organization theory. They're still structured around a Theory X view of employees, but most of our employees are Theory Y. So you're shoehorning Theory Y employees, these very creative and innovative employees, into very classical Theory X centralized top-down types of organizations. So McGregor made the argument that Theory X organizations have a responsibility to transform themselves into Theory Y organizations. And he provided us with a lot of strategies to doing that you'll learn in your 660 class. But one example of those strategies is a strategy known as job enrichment. In job enrichment, what an organization will do is it will allow an employee to participate in the changing of the position description. And so you'll talk to employees, you'll ask employees, what do you want to be in 5 or 10 years? Where do you see yourself in 5 or 10 years? What types of skills do you want to develop so that you can achieve what you're trying to achieve in the future? And then incorporate that information into the creation of the position description. So if someone wants to aspire in a city to become a city manager, well, we want to try and incorporate some of the skills that they'll need to develop in order to be a city manager. So perhaps we're going to give them the opportunity to supervise other employees. We may give them the opportunity to rotate between departments in the city so that they can kind of get a flavor of what all the different departments do that will help better prepare them for the role of a city manager. That type of job enrichment is a way in which we can take a Theory X organization and make it seem a little bit more Theory Y to better fit the wants, needs, and desires of these Theory Y types of employees. Chris Ardress, who was directly a student of Douglas McGregor, took McGregor's theories and built upon them and developed his own theory known as the theory of personal growth needs. And Ardress made the argument that people's needs will not be static in that they will develop over time. And people go through a maturation process. As people go through a maturation process, they will develop things such as deepening interests. They'll become interested in deeper concerns, not such superficial types of concerns. They will take a longer time perspective and that they'll start being more concerned about 20 and 30 years down the road as opposed to 20 or 30 minutes into the future. They will become more concerned about society and their community and their role in making their community a better place. They'll become more entrenched within their community. They will start aspiring to superordinate positions. They'll start aspiring to higher levels of authority, willing to take on more responsibility and authority with those higher level positions. And so Ardress argues it's the job of the organization to help people move through their personal growth cycle. And the organization can help them move through this personal growth cycle by giving them those opportunities for moving up in the organization, by giving them opportunities to develop their skill sets. So again, as you can see with human resource management theorists, it's now become not just what can the individual employee do for the organization, but what can the organization then do for the employee to help that employee develop as a human resource. Even if that employee, once they have developed as a human resource, they then take those talents out of the organization and then move out of the organization to another organization. In human resource management theory, that is okay because there is inherent value in helping people develop as human resources beyond just what they can directly give back to the organization. So that's this neoclassical school known as Human Resource Management School of Thought. So yeah, as you can see, as we are moving more and more modern in terms of our chronology, we're now starting to take into account more and more the individual employees. And we're adding more and more self-worth onto individual employees as opposed to just focusing on the organization's goals and objectives. And that's kind of that trajectory that we see in the evolution of theoretical perspectives in the field of public administration. So we move into the 1960s and 70s and 80s. We start to see the literature shift again and start to shift more into what's known as the system school, where we start to realize that organizations oftentimes interact with their environment. Organizations get very involved in their environment. They are influenced by their environment, and in turn, they also influence their environments. So in systems theory, we start looking beyond the walls of the organization. We look at the role of the organization in a bigger system of influences. And this is where the environmental impact of how organizations experience their environment really becomes very important for the study of public administration. In systems theory, you basically have two different approaches to systems theory. You have what's known as closed or natural systems theory, and then you have what's known as open systems theory. In a closed or natural systems theory, you look at the organization kind of like John Gauss and kind of like a living organism. And you say, this organization, like a living organism, is going to go through a life cycle. And as it goes through its life cycle, it's going to go through this process known as entropy. Just like any living creature, as it ages, it goes through an entropy process. And during the entropy process, living organisms dissipate energy into their environment. And essentially, then once that organism, not to depress you too much, once an organism has lost the types of energy it needs to survive, it will then go out of existence. And these closed natural systems theorists will argue the same thing for an organization. That goes through this entropy process, organizations dissipate energy and resources into their environment. And then at some point in time, the organization will then no longer have the resources it needs to survive in the future, and that organization will then go out of existence. Open systems theorists, by contrast, argue that as organizations go through their life cycle, they interact with their environment. And as they interact with their environment, they actually bring new energy into the organization. So yes, they go through an entropy process by which organizations will lose resources, they will dissipate resources and energy out into the environment, but at the same time, they are importing new energies and new resources into their organization. That ability to import new resources into the organization is what's known as negative entropy. And in negative entropy, you can now survive as an organization well into the future, much longer than you could survive as a closed or natural system. Because now you're bringing in all these new energies from your environment, things such as a well-trained professional labor pool, things such as resources in terms of monetary resources, things such as political support among elected officials and those appropriators who are deciding how much money you are going to get. Things such as support among clients and support among the public. All of those things are different resources in the environment that can then be brought into the organization through this negative entropy type of process. Systems theory, we don't really have time to go into it here tonight in this class, but systems theory is really an interesting theory that you'll spend a good bit of time talking about in your 660 course. Because what we see is that different organizations have different strategies that they use in order to import these energies from the environment. And there's a 25-cent word in the theory known as equifinality. And equifinality says that different organizations will use different paths and will use different strategies in order to find that balance between the organization and its external environment. That's important because that then suggests to us that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. So unlike what the classical theorists are trying to tell us, it really does depend. It depends upon the organization, its environment. Every organization will have a different environment and will then interact differently with its environment. There are multiple different paths by which organizations will interact with their environment. Hence, again, the reason why I love the answer, it depends. And I think you really want to characterize kind of this whole evolution of the theory and theories in public administration. It really has been moving away from that one size fits all approach of the classical school to a much more contextual, contingency based approach of we have to look at the context of the situation to understand how to best run and best manage our public organizations. In 660, you'll then also talk about a lot of more modern theories. You'll talk about quality management theory from the 70s and the 80s. You'll talk about leadership theories that have really experienced a major renaissance of late. The one that I like to focus on here in this course is kind of our last theory that we look at is organization culture. And we've made mention of organization culture before. Back when we talked about accountability and ethics, we said that in order to correctly apply ethical principles, we had to take into account the culture of each organization. Every organization has its own culture, has its own set of norms and values and expected behaviors. The organization culture school of thought, headed up by this author known as Edgar Schein. And Edgar Schein was he was outside the world of public administration. He was kind of a management slash sociologist type of an approach. Schein's organization culture theory says that, again, every organization has its own set of norms, values, and expectations, which is what a culture is. Each one of those organizations will then create clues, if you will, that will help us study that unique organizational culture. So if you're going to study the culture of an ancient society, you would probably go out on an archaeological dig, and you would go on that archaeological dig and you would dig up artifacts. So you dig up things such as eating utensils and bowls, and maybe you would dig up pictures that were painted on walls. All those artifacts give us insight into the culture of that ancient society, what those people valued, how they behaved on a daily basis, how they interacted with each other on a daily basis. You get all that information about that culture through those things like artifacts. Organizations, Schein argues, also create artifacts as well. So the tangible artifacts you get from an organization will be things such as meeting agendas, the minutes of meetings, policy and procedure manuals, and written rules and regulations. Those are all the tangible artifacts of an organization that will give us insight into how that organization operated and behaved on a daily basis. Those artifacts are really easy to see. They're right there for us. You can see the agenda, you can see the minutes, it's right there. At a more hidden level of culture is something such as the espoused values of the culture. Espoused values are things such as the mission statement, the values in which that mission statement is built upon. As a NASPA accredited program, we are required not just to have a mission development process, but we're also required to have public sector values. I shared those with you on our first night of class, the values for our program. Those are our espoused values that we live by as a program. At the deepest level of culture are what are referred to as basic assumptions. Basic assumptions are essentially the assumptions that we all share as members of the organization. We don't talk about a lot, but they're just assumptions for how we interact with each other and how we behave when we interact with each other. So things such as valuing everyone equally, treating everyone with civility in a collegial way. Those are just assumptions. We assume that we all know that, and we take those assumptions and they will then guide our behavior. We don't necessarily write them down. We don't necessarily put them up on walls, but we just all share those assumptions, those shared understandings of how we behave and how we value each other. Those basic assumptions are much more hidden, and they're sometimes more difficult to get at and to see when we study the culture of an organization. Leaders can embed culture into their organizations. And you'll get into this in 660, but Schein tells us there are what he calls primary and secondary embedding mechanisms, strategies that leaders can use to embed new cultures into their organization. So things as simple as like slogans. A slogan is an embedding mechanism for culture. In my district, we hired a new superintendent who came in, and she brought with her a slogan. I think it's "Together we can achieve more." And that then went on to every piece of stationery. It went into the boardroom. It went into the schools. Went in everywhere. So everyone saw that slogan. That's a method of embedding culture. How leaders treat their employees in terms of what they discipline employees for versus what they provide praise for. All of that can also give employees some insight into what is valued by that organization culture. And so if someone becomes employee of the week because of a certain type of behavior, well, now you know that the leader values that behavior. So that's something that's probably valued by the organization as well. Organization culture is important for our understanding of the evolution of these theoretical perspectives because now we have really gotten into very much that contextual approach in that every organization has its own unique culture. And to study and understand that organization, you must understand first the culture of that organization. So it is no longer the one size fits all search for a panacea as it was in the classical school. Now it's a much more nuanced, contextual way of studying public organizations. My question always is, so what? The big so what question here is, well, it makes it more difficult for us as students of public administration to study public organizations because we no longer have these universal maxims that we can apply across every organization. We must first look at the context of the organization, the culture of that organization, before we can select the most appropriate approach to use in managing and leading that organization. So it's a much more nuanced, much more contextual, much more sophisticated and difficult way of studying public organizations. But I think it's much more appropriate than what we had back in the classical school of organization theory. So that in a very large nutshell, in about an hour and 20 minutes, is a discussion of about 150 years of the development of theoretical perspectives within the field of public administration. This serves a duality of purposes. One purpose, obviously, is to kind of whet your appetite for your PPA 660 organization theory course. But more importantly, for our focus here in this course, it allows us to better see the development of the field of study of public administration, to better answer that question of, does public administration meet the criteria for being a separate academic discipline? We certainly have developed a lot of theoretical perspectives, but we have borrowed a lot of those theoretical perspectives from other disciplines. Public administration, at its very heart, is a multidisciplinary field of study. So, as you can see, we've borrowed some theories from business, we've borrowed some theories from psychology, we've borrowed some from law, we've borrowed some from sociology. I didn't mention the physics one tonight because of time, but when you take 660, we'll talk about something called field theory and how we borrowed field theory from the world of physics and applied it to the study of public administrators and public organizations. So we do borrow a lot from other disciplines, modify those theories, and then make them apply to our public organizations and the phenomena that we study here in the world of public administration. So based upon that information, as well as the information that we covered last week, I want you to take all this information, consider it, distill it into an answer of, do you believe that public administration is an academic discipline? And then provide a justification for your answer. Because again, as students in a MPA program, or even if you're just in this one MPA course, it's important when we study public administration to know what we are studying and how we study that field. So now you also have all the information you need to do scenario number 5 on the midterm assessment. On that scenario, remember, I'm asking you to select 2 classical theorists. So you're going to be selecting from Max Weber, Frederick Taylor, Luther Gulick, or any of the others that Don Kettle talks about that you think would apply well for the scenario. And then select 2 of the neoclassical theorists, anybody from the world of human relations, human resource management, systems theory, organization culture, any of those neoclassical theories that we talked about. Select 2 of those that you think would apply best or most appropriately in that scenario. Any questions on this information? I know we went through it very quickly, but this is just kind of a foreshadowing of what you'll get later on in the program. Okay. If not, then I think we are certainly due for a break. I think you would all agree with that. So let's go ahead and take a break. Let's come back at I say we'll come back at 5:40. I think would be good. Come back at 5:40, and then we're going to shift gears into the final primary topic we'll talk about, which is the functions of public administration. And we'll start talking about the roles of public administrators in policy, as well as in implementing and evaluating public programs. So come back at 5:40, and we'll then shift into that last third, if you will, of the course content. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We're back from break, and now we're going to shift into the third major topic that we tend to cover in this class, and that's the functions of public administration, functions of public administrators. And so the first part of our semester together, we talked about the constitutional basis of public administration and the meaning of public service. Then we talked about the second part of class, we talked about the study of public administration, differences between sectors, and public administration as an academic discipline. Now, in the third part of the course, we talk about the different functions of public administration, the types of things that public administrators tend to do on a daily basis. So, save bandwidth, I'll turn off my camera now, and we'll jump into our slides. So, the first thing we tend to look at when we talk about the functions of public administration is we look at the role that public administrators play in public policy and the public policy process. Now, a lot of people sometimes get confused with our program in that we are a Masters of Public Administration program, but we are housed within a department called the Graduate Center for Public Policy and Administration. And so sometimes I'll see folks say, well, I graduated with a master's in public policy administration. Now, it's a master's of public administration degree. We just happen to be within a department called public policy and administration. But it really does underscore the close connection there is between policy and administration, in that typically, as public administrators, as we talked about last week, we have prominent roles to play in really all the phases of the public policy process. So we're going to start talking about the roles played by public administrators in public policy, and then we will shift gears and talk about the roles played by public administrators in the implementation, evaluation of public programs. So before we start, I think it's important for us to get a good sense of what's the difference between a public policy and a public program. You know, after all, in our core curriculum, we have 670 policy analysis, and then we have another class, 696, which does program evaluation. So we kind of separate the two out in our program. There are some MPA programs around the country that will combine policy and program together into the same course. I think there's certainly validity to both approaches. We tend to separate them out. When you look at the differences between public policies and public programs, public policies tend to be much more general and much broader in nature and in scope. So if you want to think about it in terms of like an umbrella, the umbrella part is the public policy. So the overarching part of the umbrella, that's the public policy. And then what holds that overarching policy up will be these individual public programs. So public programs tend to be the more specific approaches that are meant to then help implement the overall goals of that public policy. So you think about a public policy such as welfare policy. And in the mid 1990s, when we reformed welfare policy, we were reforming it so that we could move people from welfare to work. So the ultimate goal of this umbrella policy was to move people from the welfare roles into gainful employment. Then we had several different programs that we could use in order to accomplish that goal. So you have programs such as a computer literacy program. You have a program such as a child care program. You have a program such as a resume writing type of program, how to get a job type of programs. Those are all programs that then serve as the stanchions or the support for the overarching public policy. So that's kind of this relationship between public policies and public programs. So they certainly are related, but policies are more general in nature and programs tend to be more specific. So there are different ways in which we study public policies as compared to how we study public programs. So let's start with the focus on public policies to begin with. Now, when you take your 670 policy analysis class, you will talk about the policymaking process, and your instructor will walk you through the different phases in the policy process. Some instructors will introduce you to 4 different phases in the policy process. I tend to combine the first 2 together and just talk about 3 major phases in policymaking. For me, the first major phase in the policymaking process is what we talked about last week with policy formation or formulation. When the policy is being designed, when the policy is being created. Before a policy can be formulated, that issue must first get onto the formal decision-making agenda of a decision-making body. So this takes us back to John Gaventa and his second phase of power, that mobilization of bias. So if you can set the agenda, you inherently have power because that allows you to determine what issues get policies made and which issues will never have a policy made to deal with that issue. So in agenda setting, we're looking at the process by which an issue gets on the formal decision-making agenda. John Kingdon, you have an article in the classics text by John Kingdon. John Kingdon talks a lot about agenda setting and how policies make it from the basic social consciousness, if you will, what Kingdon would call the primordial soup of issues, and how those issues then get out of that primordial soup and get onto the formal decision-making agenda of a decision-making body. Kingdon points out to us that one of the primary ways in which issues get on the formal decision-making agenda is through these triggering events. We've talked about that in a previous class. That something will happen, such as the assassination of a president, or the crash of an airliner, or a terrorist attack, that will serve as a triggering event that opens up a policy window that then allows an issue to get on the agenda of Congress or the agenda of a state or local legislative body, and then a policy can then be formulated dealing with that issue. So oftentimes it's these triggering events that will move issues onto the formal decision-making agenda. But during the formulation phase, this is when we are making decisions about how we are going to approach and deal with this issue or this problem, what our public policies should look like. And inherently in this formulation process, we are engaged in decision making. We are deciding the approaches that we should take to deal with this problem. That decision making process involves not just elected officials, but as we talked about last week, public administrators as well. And that public administrators are usually the ones who have the technical expertise in that issue or with that problem. And they can then bring that expertise to bear in the policy formulation process. Also, those public administrators have the ability to bring issues to the attention of decision-making bodies. And so sometimes you'll have agency heads that will contact members of Congress and say, here is something that we are dealing with. Here is a problem that people are running into that our agency is seeing. And then that could sometimes be the impetus for the creation of a public policy. So clearly there are roles for public administrators to play in policy formulation. But throughout this decision-making process, we really need to get a good handle on how we make decisions about how we're going to address this program as compared to how we address this program or this policy. So there are 4 main decision-making models that you will encounter multiple times throughout this MPA program. Some of them you may have heard of before, some may be brand new to you, but the 4 different decision-making models we oftentimes see in the policy formulation process are rational comprehensive decision-making, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and garbage can model of decision-making. So let's walk through each one of those decision-making models to better understand how we make decisions about what our approaches should be in terms of dealing with issues and problems in policy formulation. So the first one that I'm sure you're aware of already is the rational comprehensive decision-making process. It is rational and it is comprehensive. So you talk about something being rational, like with Max Weber. We talk about collecting empirical data, collecting empirical information, then analyzing that empirical information in an objective way, and then rendering decisions based upon the analysis of that information. That is a rational type of process. A comprehensive process is when we take into account all the possible information that is out there in rendering our decisions. So, in a rational, comprehensive decision making process, step number one is to clearly define our policy goals. So, we're clearly defined here are the goals that we are trying to achieve by addressing this issue through this policy. And we clearly define those goals and we agree upon what those goals are. Once we have clearly defined goals, our second step is then to go out there and collect all the available information, all the information out there in the universe on this goal, on this issue that we're trying to address. So we collect all the available information. After we collect all that available information, you identify all the possible ways of solving this problem, all the different means for achieving your goals. So you're going to be putting together a full range of alternative solutions to this problem. Because at the end of the day, when we are creating policies, we're usually creating policies to try and address some defined problem. And so we put together a full range of alternative solutions for solving this problem. From that full range of alternative solutions, we'll then select the best alternative solution and will then implement that best alternative solution as our public policy. So our public policy that emerges out of the rational and comprehensive approach will be the best solution to the policy problem that we are trying to address. Clearly, the advantages of rational and comprehensive decision making is that it's both rational and comprehensive. We're taking into account all the information that's out there in order to put together this full range of alternatives, which then allows us to select our best solution to a problem. Clearly, the criticisms, the limitations of rational and comprehensive are many. Number one, there are unintended consequences. There are externalities of every solution that we select. And sometimes it's impossible for us to know what all those unintended consequences will be. Some of the consequences of a solution may not emerge until 10, 15, 20 years down the line. So we come up with some new way to protect people in their cars in terms of alternative to airbags. But then 5 or 10 years down the line, we find out that the chemicals we use in this solution are harmful to the health of the people who are occupying that car. We didn't know that when we came up with the solution, but something we found out 10, 15, 20 years later. We couldn't have known those unintended consequences at that point in time. Also, it's difficult for us as human beings to be able to gather all the available information and then use it to select the best alternative. As Herbert Simon, a very famous public administration scholar, tells us, we as human beings have what he calls bounded rationality, which means that we as human beings have cognitive limitations. There are limitations on the amount of information that we can gather. There are limitations on the amount of information that we can process and understand. These cognitive limitations oftentimes will make it impossible for us to use rational, comprehensive decision making. We also have time limitations that we are working within. And if this is a very serious societal problem, it's something that we want to address sooner as opposed to later. So we may not have the luxury of spending 2 or 3 years to collect all this information and analyze the problem. We may need to develop a solution tomorrow to address this problem today. So oftentimes we're not able to be rational, comprehensive in the way in which we formulate our public policies. So a second, more realistic approach is what's called incrementalism. And there's a very famous study by a man named Charles Lindblom. And Charles Lindblom wrote this article, The Science of Muddling Through. And in this article, he talked about how agencies tend to use incrementalism as opposed to rational comprehensive decision making. He got a lot of acclaim for this article. He won a lot of awards for the article. He was shocked by the number of awards he won. He said that all he was doing was just describing how decisions are made in public policy and describing how decisions are made in public organizations. He wasn't developing any novel new theory. But the theory has come to be known as incrementalism. Incrementalism is kind of the complete opposite of rational comprehensive. So whereas in rational comprehensive, you clearly define the goals that you're trying to achieve with your policy, here in incrementalism, goals are not easily defined. Not only are they not easily defined, it's difficult for us to gain broad agreement on what those goals are. Sometimes it's hard for us to know the difference between a long-term goal and a short-term objective. So right here at step number one in incrementalism, we recognize we can't be purely rational in identifying our goals. Second step, instead of collecting all the information that is out there as we do in rationality, in incrementalism, we collect as much information as we possibly can. We have cognitive limitations. We have limitations in the amount of time we have to collect information. So therefore, we'll collect as much information as we can collect. We'll then take this limited information and we'll use it to create a limited range of alternative solutions for achieving our goals. Now, in the rational approach, we put together a full range of alternatives. Here, we're only able to put together a limited range of alternatives. What we'll then do is we'll engage in what's called limited successive comparisons. So we'll compare solution A to solution B, and then solution B to solution C, and solution C to solution D, then A to D, then B to D, and so on and so on. Those are limited successive comparisons. From those limited successive comparisons, we will then select the first appropriate solution that works for us today. So we're not selecting the best solution, we're selecting the first appropriate solution. We're not selecting the best solution because we don't know what the best solution is. If we have not collected all the information, if we have not put together a full range of solutions, we cannot say with any certainty that we have selected the best solution. The best solution may still be floating around out there in the environment. We've never even thought of that best solution. So we select the first appropriate solution that works for us today. And then we implement that appropriate solution as the basis for our public policy. Obviously, the advantage of incrementalism is that it's much more practical given our bounded rationality and our time constraints. The criticism is that with incrementalism, you will just make small changes to your policy, usually from one year to the next. You're never really going back and making any major whole-scale changes to your policies. So if a policy is not working, you're probably going to continue that policy, just make minor tweaks to it each year, but you're never going to go back and revisit that policy and replace it with something brand new. Lindblom argued that because of our cognitive and resource limitations, typically our decision-making and policy formulation is much more incrementalism than it is rational comprehensive. Lindblom referred to rational comprehensive as being the root approach and incrementalism as being the branch approach. So you think about a tree, if you get to the root of the problem, get to the root of the tree, that's rational comprehensive. Incrementalism, you're never able to get to the root of the problem, so instead you're dealing with all the branches. And so you're working out there on the ends of the branches. That's the incremental approach. So rational comprehensive and incrementalism in terms of decision-making models are diametrically opposed from each other. In the gray area between, there is a third model known as mixed scanning. And it comes to us by way of this theorist by the name of Amitai Etzioni. Etzioni argues in mixed scanning that we will combine rationality and incrementalism. So try and combine the best of both worlds. Essentially, for big issues, for momentous issues, we will be as rational, comprehensive as we can be. For smaller, more mundane day-to-day issues, we can get away being more incremental and putting less energy and less resources into our decision making. So you think about public budgeting, and we'll talk about the management of fiscal resources at the end of our semester together. But in budgeting, we see both rationality as well as incrementalism. The vast majority of our budgeting tends to be done through incrementalism. So we look at what we spent money on last year and how much money we spend, and then we make small incremental changes to it for the upcoming year. That's incrementalism. That's how we make most of our budgets. That's how we usually deal with our operating budgets. However, whenever it comes time to build that new facility, that new school, or that new city hall, or that new recreation center, that's a much bigger decision because we're talking about maybe 60, 80, $100 million. We're talking about a building that we're going to be living with for several generations. So we want to be much more careful and deliberative in our decision making. So we have a separate type of budget called a capital budget. And that capital budget is a much more rational way of deciding which projects we're going to fund and which projects we're not going to fund. So the vast majority of budgeting in the public sector is incremental, but every now and then for our capital projects, we try and be a little bit more rational, comprehensive. So it's a combination of the two: rationality for big decisions, incrementalism for small decisions. The problem with mixed scanning, obviously, is it's somewhat subjective. It's not always that easy to say this is a big decision, this is a small decision. What is a big issue for one person may be a small issue for another person, and vice versa. So there is some subjectivity in determining when to use rational and comprehensive decision making versus incrementalism. Typically, we'll tend to be more rational when we have a major triggering event that has occurred that will make us completely rethink the way in which we are dealing with a policy. So obviously, September 11th was a major triggering event, and we were very rational, comprehensive in the way in which we made changes to Homeland Security policy. Now, we did it relatively quickly, but we were much more rational in the way in which we decided to create a new department and all these other entities fundamentally changed the way in people engage in air travel. All that was a very rational, comprehensive response to a major triggering event that galvanized public opinion. Then there is this fourth decision-making model, which happens to be one of my personal favorites, and that's what's known as the garbage can model of decision-making. Now, I don't like the title garbage can model because I think it's a bit of a misnomer. You think garbage can model decision-making, you think, well, you throw everything in a garbage can, you shake it up, and what you get is what you get. And there's really more rhyme and reason to it than just that. In garbage can model decision making, our policy decisions tend to be made at what's called the confluence of four different streams. So when these four different streams of thought flow together, that's where our policy decisions tend to be made. And in garbage can model decision making, the four different policy streams are participants, problems, solutions, and then choice opportunities, otherwise known as triggering events that we've already talked about. So your first stream are your participants. So in order to make a major change to the way in which we're addressing a policy, we have to have the quote unquote right participants in place. We have to have people in decision-making positions who are predisposed to making a major change to the way in which we are addressing this issue. So you have to have people who are predisposed to being more rational and comprehensive in the way in which they're addressing the problem. Second stream is the problem stream. And so, as Kingdon tells us, we've got kind of this primordial soup of all these problems that are floating around out there, that we all kind of have a general understanding that all these things are problems. However, we have to have a problem that emerges from that stream that is relatively well defined and also has some pretty broad agreement in terms of what that problem is. So there'll be a problem that emerges that is defined, and you have agreement on the definition of that problem. Then your third stream is the solution stream. So you got all these possible alternative solutions to this problem that has been identified. Now, this is where the garbage can model decision making really differs from rational, comprehensive, and incrementalism. In rational, comprehensive, and incremental decision making, you identify your problem and then you generate a solution. They're very linear types of decision making models. Garbage can model decision making is not linear, it's non-linear in nature, in that solutions may actually predate problems. So some of those solutions may have been created years ago for other problems. So you think about something like, go back to welfare reform in the mid 1990s. The problem was identified as welfare being kind of a self-perpetuating cycle, in that generation after generation of Americans were kind of trapped in this welfare cycle. And so you want to try and break this welfare cycle. Well, the way in which you do it, the solutions, there are lots of solutions out there. The solution that was chosen was a solution known as a block grant, this general grant to state governments, whereby states can use that money in a variety of different ways, as long as how they spend the money helps them achieve the ultimate goals of welfare policy reform. So we took a solution from the 1940s and we applied that 1940 solution to a problem in 1996. That's kind of what I like to call the Quentin Tarantino way of making decisions. If you're a fan of Quentin Tarantino movies, you know that they're usually non-sequential and that they kind of bounce around all over the place in terms of the timeline. Well, that's kind of similar here. The solutions can predate problems. They're not always developed as a response to a problem. And then fourth, as we talked about, you have a trigger event. Something happens that galvanizes public opinion around the idea that we really need to make a change to the way in which we are thinking about this issue and creating our public policies. I think when we have major changes to our public policies and policy formulation, we oftentimes see those major changes as a result of the garbage can model of decision making. Here is an example. I gave you an example with welfare reform before, but here's another example of garbage can model decision making. So we ended up having this Value Jet 582 crash. We had this airliner that crashed in 1996 into the Florida Everglades, killing everyone who was on board of the plane, crew as well as passengers alike. So we had this event that happened, and people said, we really need to reevaluate how we can improve airline safety. So we had the participants in place, and that we had consumer rights groups who for years have been lobbying Congress for stricter airline policies in order to make airline travel safer. We had members of Congress who knew that this was a problem that needed to be addressed, and so they were predisposed to come up with a solution. The problem of airline safety was that what had happened with this Value Jet 582 flight is that a fire had broken out in the cargo bay of the plane. And because of that fire, there were no smoke detectors in the cargo bay. And so by the time that fire was recognized by the crew, it had already burned through the electronic system and the plane was not recoverable. And then unfortunately, the plane crashed in the Everglades. So there are a lot of solutions to the problem, but one of the solutions that was a pre-existing solution was smoke detectors and requiring smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes so that you could detect a fire before the fire got out of control. That's a pre-existing solution that certainly pre-existed the problem of airline safety and this triggering event. But when the triggering event happened in 1996, you then had all four of these streams of thought flow together. And at the confluence of those four streams of thought, we then ended up with a policy that now requires the placement of smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes. So it's kind of an example of how a new public policy was formulated around the decision-making model known as garbage can model of decision-making. And again, we oftentimes see major changes happen to our policies as a result of these triggering events that really galvanize public opinion around the idea that we need to make a change to the way in which we are dealing with this problem or this issue. So the first stage is formulating the policy, and you'll talk more in your 670 class about policy formulation and how you design public policies. Well, public administrators certainly do have a role to play. And so going back to the Value Jet example, we have public administrators who had expertise in terms of airline safety. And so they knew that there were planes out there that didn't have smoke detectors. They knew how this fire logistically caused the demise of Value Jet 582. they had that information that they were able to bring to bear in that policy formulation process. Once policies are implemented, we then know that we move into the implementation or execution phase. So the second phase of the policy process is implementation execution. Oftentimes, as we've talked about before, when policies are passed through Congress, they are passed in very vague, ambiguous terms. In order to get the agreement of a majority members of Congress, you need to have relatively vague legislation. The more specifics, the more opposition you engender. So when these policies come out of Congress, they need to have a lot of details to fill in exactly how they are being implemented. And that then leads us to the administrative rulemaking process and another role for public administrators to play in implementation. They need to write the rules that will then govern the implementation of these relatively vague and ambiguous policies. Implementation of policy is difficult. And in 670, you'll talk about a lot of the different obstacles to implementation. But one of the most famous public administration studies that looked at policy implementation was this one that was done by Pressman and Waldowski. And Jeffrey Pressman and Aaron Waldowski did this study of a federal program, how it was being implemented in Oakland, California. And when they looked at this federal program being implemented at the local level in Oakland, California, what they found out is that there were a lot of different issues and obstacles that kept this policy from being properly implemented. And some of the issues, some of the obstacles that they identified were things such as multiple goals. This policy was an education policy, but it had multiple goals articulated within the policy, and sometimes these goals conflicted with each other. So administrators, when they were implementing this policy, didn't know which goal to achieve when one goal came into conflict with another goal. So too many goals can make a policy difficult to implement. This policy also left a lot of decision-making in the hands of the implementers. And Pressman Waldowski realized that the more decisions that implementers have to make in the implementation of a policy, the less likely that the policy will be successfully implemented. The intensity of the implementers also had a role to play in the success of implementation. How strongly an implementer supported the policy could have a positive impact upon implementation. The more strongly someone opposed implementation, the more likely it was that that policy would be implemented. So do the implementers support the policy, and how strongly do they support that policy? Another barrier to implementation they found was the amount of bargaining. The more bargaining that occurs in the implementation process between the implementers, the less likely it is to have successful implementation. And the creation of new agencies. Sometimes when we implement policies, especially federal policies, we will create new agencies that are responsible for the implementation of that policy. Sometimes the creation of new agencies will create turf wars with existing agencies and really just kind of muddy the waters and complicate the process of implementation. So even the best formulated policies, the best designed policies can fail if they are not properly implemented. The one obstacle that Pressman Waldowski really focused upon was the intensity of the support of the implementers. And so they created a really simple table here where they looked at, did implementers have a positive or a negative view of the policy, and then how strongly positive or how strongly negative were their views of the policy. So successful implementation was primarily based upon how strongly implementers either supported or did not support that policy. So as you can see, I know it's a little blurry there. It didn't translate well into the slide. But in terms of direction of preference, if you have implementers who are very positive and do support the policy, and they strongly support the policy, then you'll have very few delays in implementation and you'll have no bargaining. The policy will just be implemented very quickly and very successfully. It's a very easy implementation. However, the worst case scenario is in the bottom right hand, in the bottom left hand cell, and that's if you have implementers who oppose the policy, and they oppose the policy very strongly. So a very high negative level of preference toward the policy. So if people really feel very negatively about the policy, the implementers feel very negatively about the policy, that's where you have maximum delay. That's where you have a lot of bargaining and even bargaining over the very essentials of the policy implementation itself. These are the types of policies, types of situations where the policies are just simply not successfully implemented. If you have a majority of your implementers who are positive, but just not that strongly positive about the policy, then you're in for some minor delays. You're still not going to have a whole lot of bargaining, but you'll have some minor delays in the implementation. Some implementers will be dragging their feet a little bit. If you have very low negative feelings on the part of implementers, you'll get moderate delays. You'll have bargaining, but you'll have bargainings primarily over the peripherals, bargainings over the marginal of the policy, not over the essentials of the policy. It all leads us to the conclusion that Martha Durthick tells us that it's important for us to build support among implementers. Public administrators certainly have a major role to play in policy implementation, and there are a lot of ways in which public administrators can slow down and completely stop the successful implementation of a policy. The best way to build support among implementers of a policy implementation is to involve those implementers. The more you involve them in the policy formulation, the more buy-in they will have in implementing the policy successfully. And this is what has led to even more of a pronounced role of public administrators in formulation, because policymakers have come to realize that if they don't include the implementers in formulation, the policy is probably never going to be successfully implemented. And so we see even more and more of a role for public administrators to play in both policy formulation as well as policy implementation. But at the end of the day, we want our policies to be effective. We want our policies to achieve the goals, the stated goals that they are supposed to achieve. And in order to know how well our policies have achieved their stated goals, we have to engage in the third phase of policy process, which is evaluation. So in evaluation, we need to produce feedback on how well our policies are achieving their goals and evaluate that success. One of the problems with policy evaluation is we oftentimes have pressures to try and evaluate policies too soon. We have pressures to try and evaluate policies before those policies are ready to be evaluated. We put a lot of precious public taxpayer money into a lot of these policies and programs as well. So we want them to work, and we want to be able to show evidence that they are working and achieving their goals. But sometimes it takes time before the outcomes of success are apparent. Sometimes the outcomes of success will not be apparent for 6 months, 9 months, maybe a year down the road. So we need to wait to evaluate those policies and those programs. One device we see used a lot today in policy evaluation is the use of what are called evaluability assessments, where we'll assess the policy to see if it is ready to be evaluated. And it sounds kind of weird. You evaluate whether it's ready to be evaluated, but you see whether or not there are outcomes that are in place that are measurable, quantifiable, that we can then use in doing an evaluation of that policy. If not, then we're going to have to push policy evaluation out for a number of months, maybe a year or so, before those outcomes become readily apparent. When we're doing policy evaluation, oftentimes we'll conduct audits of policies and programs. Two different types of audits we tend to use are what are called financial or legal audits and management or performance-based audits. Financial or legal audits will ask the question, did we accomplish the goals that we were meant to accomplish? Essentially, did we spend the money on this policy the way in which we were supposed to accomplish our goals? So are we spending money in a legal manner? This gets back to our discussion of accountability and ethics and making sure that we are spending the money in the legally appropriate way in which policymakers wanted that money spent. Management performance audits will ask the question of how well are we spending the money? So we'll look at either how well we're spending the money in implementing that policy and or how well we are accomplishing the goals and outcomes that were first thought up and first developed in that policy formulation process. But obviously, public administrators will have a role to play in policy evaluation as well. So we are intricately involved in policy formulation, policy implementation, and policy evaluation. Because again, our organizations are the ones that are responsible for implementing these policies and achieving these policy goals and objectives. So that's one of the major functions we play as public administrators. In addition to implementing these overarching policies, we also then implement these specific programs that underpin and support these general policy goals. And so we have a role to play as public administrators in program implementation as well as program evaluation. So your 696 research methods class is where you'll learn more about how we evaluate programs and evaluating programs from an empirically sound methodology. In other words, how do we take some of those classic social science research methods and apply them, put them in the service of program evaluation? Now, this discussion of program evaluation, the role of public administrators in program evaluation will obviously take us longer than what we have left, 25 minutes. And so I don't want to start it and then have to stop it. So I think this probably makes sense for us to stop at this point in time. Then next week, when we get together again, next Monday, what we'll do is we'll start the class with a discussion of the final assessment. I'll have the final assessment available on Canvas by then. I'll walk you through the 5 scenarios and the questions relate to each of those scenarios in the first part of class. Then once we finish talking about the final assessment, then we'll pick up our discussion here with the role of public administrators in program evaluation. I'll take you through the different steps, the 7 different steps in program evaluation, and highlight the roles that public administrators play in each of those 7 different steps. And then we'll kind of wrap up our discussion of policy and program evaluation by talking about effectiveness. And we'll really get into a definition of what do we determine to be effectiveness. And I'll show you 4 different models that have been developed within the discipline of public administration to help us understand what we mean by effectiveness. And I'll present you with the goal model and the systems resource model and the participant satisfaction model and the internal process model, just 4 different ways of measuring effectiveness. Then from that point in time, if time is remaining in that next week's class session, we'll move into a discussion of management of human resources. If not, then we can always push that to our next week together when we talk about management of human resources, and then wrap up the entire show with a discussion of the management of fiscal resources. So we'll stop here and then we'll pick up next time with our discussion of the role of public administrators in program evaluation. Sound good? Everyone good? Any questions or anything at all at this point? Since we have a few minutes that are not being used. Everybody good? Okay. Just to let you know, I am traveling a bit. So on Wednesday, I'm heading to DC. So I will be out of town the end of this week, all the way through until Sunday night. I will have availability via email. So if you have any questions, always feel free to email me. The next Wednesday, not this Wednesday, next Wednesday, then I'm heading off to Northern California to do this accreditation site visit. And so then I'll be out of town for another 4 days. So doing a lot of traveling over the next 2 weeks, but I'm always available via email if you have any questions. Okay. All right. Hope everyone stays dry. Hope you have a good week, and I will talk to you again then next Monday. I'll have this recording up on our site no later than tomorrow morning. Thanks, everyone. Take care.